Welcome everybody, and big thanks for making it through the Storm Henry, to be here tonight for our COP21, the Paris Conference of the Parties discussion. So all of you, I'm sure, will be aware of the Conference of the Parties just before Christmas in Paris, and we've got an agreement out of Paris which we're going to discuss tonight with this great panel I've got behind me here. So I introduce myself first of all. I'm Dave Reay. I'm based here in the School of GeoSciences at the University of Edinburgh, and I direct the Global Environment and Society Academy, which some of you will know well, and that's part of the university and is a co-sponsor of this event tonight. In terms of our panel, though, most importantly, let me go to, so I've got their biogs here, so let's find them. So Urte Macikene is our EUSA, so the Edinburgh University Student Association Vice President Services. She was elected by students last year, so she's got a full term, she's halfway through that. Urte works to make sustainability and ethical responsibility central to EUSA services. She represents student interests within the university and wider community and lobbies for increased commitments to socially responsible practices. This year, key SRS issues Urte is focused on include ethical investment, a conflict minerals policy, healthy and local food in use of venues, and affordable student housing. And Urte was one of our representatives at the Paris Conference of the Parties. Excuse me, I've been talking too much already today. And so we're going to hear her thoughts as we go through this evening. Then on my immediate left, we have Hannah. Let's find your biography, Hannah. So Hannah is currently an online learning educator. Hannah was an undergraduate here at Edinburgh in the School of Geosciences and completed our Masters in Carbon Management as well, which is based in this building, the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. And what Hannah's doing at the moment is actually pushing the envelope in terms of education around sustainability and the environment. So Hannah's developing a course which will be open to every student in the university, and we're hoping every alumni of the university on sustainability to try and look across the disciplines, whether you're a banker or a lawyer or an environmental scientist, to reflect on what sustainability is and how that can translate into your career as an Edinburgh graduate. So Hannah was also one of our delegates at the Paris Conference of the Parties and wrote some fantastic blogs. So hopefully you've all got some information on tonight's event, and with that there are some useful links that have been provided by Claire, and definitely check out Hannah's blog. Really good insights into what it was like to be at Paris and her reflections on what it meant for climate change. Right, on my right this side is Elizabeth. So let's find your biography. So Elizabeth Dirth. Elizabeth is the vice chair of the 2050 Climate Group. So this is a large organisation of, I guess, leaders on climate change, young leaders on climate change across the whole of Scotland, I think. So several, over 100 of you, aren't there? So Elizabeth's the vice chair, so a busy job there. She's also the climate change officer for Keep Scotland Beautiful, and she mentors recent graduates for Change Agents UK. Elizabeth has worked for Keep Scotland Beautiful since 2014 and focuses on climate change policy, action, community engagement in Scotland. And prior to that, she managed a range of low-carbon behaviour change projects at the University of the West of Scotland. So thank you, Elizabeth. Next on my right, we've got Annalisa Savaresi. So Annalisa is a colleague in the School of Law here at the University of Edinburgh. She's a research fellow and in global environmental law. Annalisa does loads of different things. I'm not going to list them all. What shall I pick out here? I guess one of the key things tonight to bear in mind when Annalisa speaks is that she's lived and breathed the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, more than anyone else I know, and was at obviously Paris, but she was at the negotiations throughout last year, so often is in Bonn in what can be, I hear, hard meetings in terms of trying to get out and draw breath and think, right, what, you know, has that actually moved things on at all? So Annalisa's been a mine of information for all of us at Edinburgh in terms of in the lead up to Paris, what it was going to maybe deliver, and then helping us to understand what the outcomes have been. So thank you, Annalisa. And finally, on the far right, we have Jelte Harnmeijer. And Jelte, what have I got for you? So Jelte is a teaching fellow in carbon economics, and that's based in the economics school, but also in the School of GeoSciences and the business school. So Jelte is covering in a multidisciplinary way the work we do on climate change. So he's a key contributor to our Masters in Carbon Management in the university. Jelte is also a fellow at the James Hutton Institute. He specialises in studying and delivering distributed low-carbon energy solutions and is interested in the consequences of fuel poverty and climate change on economic and agricultural systems. The other key thing for Jelte in this building is Jelte is one of the founders of Scene Community Energy Specialists. So they're an Edinburgh-based social enterprise that helps communities generate their own renewable energy, and that's across the globe. So a real great mix of the teaching, the research, but also the application through Jelte's consultancy. So thank you all, the panel. So what we'll do, I'll sit down first, and hopefully, yeah, I can still see everyone. The format tonight is really all about your interaction. So what our panel are going to do, they're going to have 2 minutes each, and we'll start with Urte, and then we'll go along the panel, 2 minutes to give you their reflections on Paris. How did it go? How they feel about it? Maybe what their experiences were over those 2 hectic weeks. Then I'm going to throw the floor open to you for questions, and I'm hoping for lots of questions. We have a guide in terms of some topics that I'd like all of us to cover tonight, but really I'm going to be directed by you. So we'll have 2 minutes for each of our panellists, and as they're speaking, maybe you've got questions already, think up some good ones to ask our panel. So Urte, over to you, 2 minutes please.
Great. So I'm a student sabbatical officer. My job is to lobby and campaign on behalf of students, so I'm by no means an academic expert on any of the issues we're about to discuss. So I guess the key reflection for me was mainly about what I was hoping to achieve and how I personally engaged with some of the issues at the conference. And when I left, I was asked what I was going to do there, and I guess it was sort of a cross between going to some of the civil society and community events and learning from the panels at the actual conference. But actually I kind of felt like I would probably be too busy with sort of the official proceedings to do any of the activist and community stuff. And this was a really interesting part of a personal trajectory in the sense that as a student and before I was elected, I came very much from an activist background and was very involved with People and Planet and Social Society, a number of other campaigning groups on campus, which was really key to my sort of personal political development. A lot of that action focused on politicizing other sort of future activists. But during this year as a sabbatical officer, in a position of some small amount of sort of institutional authority and having access to a lot more information, it's been really easy to kind of feel invested in the institutional structures that I'm a part of. And I think that a lot of these structures achieve some great things. There's a lot of really committed, principled people within the institution and operating within them. I guess over this time, my kind of faith in grassroots campaigning politics has also been a little bit eroded in the sense that seeing some of the realities of the fact that activism sometimes, I think, uncritically sort of calls people to action and campaign without reflecting on the fact that, you know, despite the economic crisis, despite ideologically driven austerity policies for the past few years, we've still got the Conservatives in government. We've still got, you know, basis for fringe right-wing parties growing, and, you know, we sort of keep going on demonstrations and hoping something new will happen. And so, you know, in terms of the reality of the COP, whether I don't think it's right to sort of be triumphant or despairing about it. Gramsci says that we have to maintain pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And so, you know, obviously a partially binding agreement has been arrived at by all nations, which is momentous. But at the same time, it's far from ideal in ways that I'm sure we'll discuss. But I think the main takeaway for me was that I was quite saddened by how easily I kind of engaged with the official part of the conference and abandon some of the sort of civil society and activisty actions. And being there really made me viscerally realize how conservative, small c, the structure of the conference was, and how the negotiating delegations were all overwhelmingly sort of white men who occupied very privileged positions in society, that very much there was a balance of power towards rich countries and sort of corporate interests at the actual conference. And I think that's inevitable and that's the way it's going to be, but I was sort of disappointed in myself that I didn't spend more time engaging with the community aspect of it, which on reflection was really inspiring, a lot of the things that came out of that. And it's been really, really productive in terms of actually coming back and processing that experience and recommitting to student organizing and politics and sort of more fluid dynamics of shifting power and influencing those official decision-making structures.
Perfect. Thank you, Urte. Hannah, your 2 minutes on Paris. What do you think?
So I'm primarily from a science background. So one of my kind of key interests at the negotiations was, what are we saying we're going to do? So what is our target? And on the policy side of things, how are we going to share that responsibility and that distribution of effort? So I was kind of focusing on the mitigation side of things and the target setting. So I'd probably first of all say, to be honest, in terms of the kind of spectrum between optimism and pessimism of the result that we got, I'd say I'd probably somewhere in the middle, maybe slightly to the optimistic side. I think when you look at climate change as an issue, even just looking at the scientific basis of it, it's so complex. So once you add the economic, the social, the technological influences within that, the issue is incredibly complex. So to get agreement between 189 countries or parties on such a complex issue and walk away with a deal is a bit of a miracle to begin with. In terms of the actual specifics of the deal, I'm pleased in terms of the level of ambition. So we are still going collectively for a 2-degree target. There's been some talk and within the deal that we're going to have best efforts to go below that to 1.5. To be honest, I don't think that that's going to be a realistic target, but to go for 2 degrees is a very good target to set. And in terms of specifics of how we're going to get there, the deal is slightly loose in the sense that we haven't agreed that we're going to peak emissions or reduce emissions by X amount by this date. And at first I was quite sceptical of that. I kind of thought, are we being loose about this? Are we kind of almost pushing it off by not setting a distinctive target? But I've kind of came around to the fact that if we had tried to be too prescriptive, then we might not have actually got a deal in the first place. That would have been a key area of contention. And I also think to set such a specific target would be to kind of neglect the complexity of the issue. So in terms of what level of emissions we would need to peak at or reduce by a certain date, the science isn't even settled on that yet. Climate response is incredibly complex. So instead we've kind of set up a mechanism where we've said every 5 years we're going to take this stock take, we're going to see where we are, where we're going, what we need to do. And I think that kind of level of flexibility is very, very key in terms of meeting those goals. So in terms of my reflections, I'd say I'm very happy with it. It's not perfect, but I think the fact that we have a deal and it's flexible enough to build on that is really, really something to go on.
Great. Elizabeth,
Thanks.
What do you think?
I think it's probably fair to start with sort of why I was there. The Paris COP was my first experience, and it was obviously quite exciting and eye-opening. I was there on behalf of the 2050 group, and we were invited by the UN to come and speak about our work in Scotland and our vision and what we've started, which was quite exciting. So I went with a huge amount of hope and optimism. And I think probably I would feel similar to Urte in my reflections on. I felt like there was the thing that surprised me most, I think, was I felt like there was a real palpable disconnect between the people that were there because either their lives depended on it or because they were committing their lives to fighting climate change, and the people that were there to partake in legal negotiations that were there on behalf of governments. And on some level that has to be expected, but I think the palpable tension between these two groups really surprised me. Now, whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but I was really surprised by this fact. I think the experience would be very different if you were there as an individual or as a person that's committed to a cause, as compared to someone that was there as part of a ministerial team or a government team or someone that was negotiating an agreement. And I think my reflection on that would be that although there's been significant effort on behalf of the UNFCCC to push towards a more bottom-up approach, I would like to see an even more people-centred and democratic approach to building these international agreements. And that was a conclusion I wasn't expecting to be making now. I was expecting to be very pleased and excited by the process. And I think, I suppose, with respect to why I was there, the 2050 group, it works with young people and try and encourage them to take action and lead on climate change and on climate action. And I think another, perhaps my most important conclusion from my experience was that the concept of intergenerational equity, which some of you have probably heard about, remains very much that. It's very conceptual and there's very little actually being done on it. And I think there's a real disappointing gap between the frequency with which people talk about intergenerational equity or future generations or young people and their concerns and the reality that the decisions that are being made now create for these future generations. And I think it's important to reflect on the current state of the agreement and the outcomes in the INDCs. And the reality is that by the time I'm 40, we will be living in a 2-degree warmer world under the conditions created by the INDCs and the Paris Agreement. And this is something that I'm extremely uncomfortable with. And so I can't say I feel the agreement is ambitious because that's the world that it's currently creating. And even the ratchet mechanism, which has been celebrated for being something that allows for an increase in ambition, there's roughly 3 opportunities for the ratchet mechanism to come into place between now and that time period that I'm talking about. And I have doubts of whether that ratchet mechanism is going to allow for increase in ambition enough each of those 3 times to allow for us to achieve a world where we're not losing islands and losing people and having food and water scarcity and having all these extremely catastrophic effects of climate change. So I find that the way that the agreement didn't address those issues troubling. That's my sort of negative take on it. My positive take on it is something that I only came to realize after the agreement. I think I'd maybe been back for a few weeks before I started to think about this. And I think I started to come to see the Paris Agreement and the outcome as something that was not actually about climate change at all. It was about preserving the concept of multilateralism. Because in a world where there's no multilateralism, there's no hope for any progress on loss and damage. There's no hope for any progress on international or intergenerational equity or finance where developing and developed countries work together, or even adaptation or technology transfer. That progress on climate change from 2015 depends most significantly on the future of multilateralism as a concept that we can all believe in and work with. And so from that perspective, Paris was a huge success, because I can't even begin to imagine a world where that fell through and we no longer believed in this concept. So I think those are my 2 sides. I think I'd probably be slightly more pessimistic than optimistic, but I think there's, from a geopolitical perspective, there's a lot of hope, but perhaps from an intergenerational equity and maybe a human rights and people perspective, I would like a lot more.
I like the balance that's spreading through here. Just before we move on to Annalisa, so acronyms, we always use loads of acronyms. It's common, certainly from the physical sciences where I'm based, but academia generally. So INDCs, which Elizabeth mentioned, if you're not aware of them, they're the intended nationally determined contributions. So they're something which every nation, or pretty much 180 odd nations, submitted before Paris to say this is what we're going to do in terms of tackling climate change, particularly through emission reductions for the period 2020 to 2030, which was the key thing debated in Paris. So if there is an acronym mentioned and you don't understand what it is, just put your hand up and hopefully we'll know what it is. But
sorry, I should have said.
I do it all the time. Annalisa, your 2 minutes.
Thanks, Dave. Just briefly, as you said when you introduced me, I'm afraid I'm a bit of a negotiations geek. So since 2009, I have been following very closely the process that led to the adoption of the Paris Agreement. So I think it's fair to say I have a good understanding of the technical process that led to the adoption of the agreement. What do I think about it? I would say it's a proverbial half full, half empty glass, as you probably heard from the previous speakers. From the perspective of a negotiation geek, I would say it's almost a miracle we have got a treaty in Paris. Now, you can tell me, so what? We could have done without it. I quite agree with Elizabeth. If we didn't get an agreement in Paris, that would have seriously tarnished faith in the role of multi-governmental or intergovernmental processes in dealing with the problem of climate change. And that would have been a problem in itself because we need international coordination, we need interstate agreement on some cornerstones, such as the goal that was mentioned earlier. Now, international relations, international law, international policy is not a solution to all evils that are associated with climate change. And I think this is something that came out of Paris more than ever before. The issue that climate change is a problem that is at all levels of society and needs to be tackled in a systemic way at all levels of society. This entails that international law does it fit, regional, EU law in our case does it fit, and then national law. And then we go down to the level of local councils, communities. So you see, in order to get there, we need some level of agreement steering at the international intergovernmental level. If we act in Europe and the Chinese don't do their bit, it's not going to happen, and the other way around. So this is what is the good message coming out of Paris. We are all in this together, at least. Hopefully we are. We'll see. The story of the Paris Agreement remains to be told. Very long regulatory season will start now, because when a treaty like this is adopted, what happens next is that parties get together and flesh out all the tiny little rules that will regulate their collective action. These rules, only by the very fact of their adoption, will tell us a great deal as to how serious parties are about achieving the 2-degree goal and what mechanism will they use in order to hold each other accountable. So this will tell us a bit of the story, and then when the agreement starts to be implemented post-2020, we'll see how effective this is. So, cautious optimism from my side, I would say. I would not have said this just a month ago. So, good stuff.
Yeah, there's a theme developing.
Yeah, I've learnt you need to get in first if you want to make sure of getting a question in. I'm astonished. I mean, I was going to ask each of you why you're not angry, but the real question is, why are we not all angry at the outcome of this COP? We have got an agreement of some form, and I'd like to know more about its legal character, but it's an agreement at the expense of it being binding and at the expense of missing its targets. Let's be completely honest. I am surprised that this amazingly balanced view of the outcome is. It's a betrayal by the political class of the world, of the people of the world, without any doubt whatsoever, because, as Elizabeth has said, the agreed INDCs, which are not mandatory, will condemn us to 3.5 degrees, not 2 degrees centigrade. So we have to, I think we have to stop being polite, but instead of putting it back to you, about, you panelists, why are you not furious? The question is, perhaps back to all of us, why were we not out on the streets saying exactly that our future has been jeopardized by the conduct of all these world leaders at this talk?
Jelte, are you going to put a kind of a darker shade on it?
Oh, is that what you want?
Give us your 2 minutes.
I can go anyway. So, 21st Conference of the Parties, 2 weeks. Well, I don't think it's helpful to think about COP21 in purely sort of atmospheric science, from an atmospheric science perspective. Imagine a room like this, but significantly larger. La Scène it was called, with twice as many audience members. And another big difference, a much more heterogeneous distribution of cultures, languages, GDP per capita, cumulative emissions, the works. So indeed, the fact that we have an agreement, frankly, surprised, I would say, most people. You know, climate change is a very, very tricky nut to crack. So that in itself, hats off. Of course, there's no time for complacency. And I think it's exactly through events like this that the golden question about, for example, the 2 degrees Celsius is going to be determined. I don't know about the other panelists to my left, but I don't know how many times I've gotten the question, are we going to make the 2 degrees Celsius target? I don't know about you, but I'm not a determinist. And I believe the answer to that question is yet to be determined. And from my point of view, COP21 was, let me put it this way, delivered as much as could reasonably have been expected. Now it's up to communities, households, local governments, municipalities, countries, transnational organizations to take it forward. And of course we have to keep watching in particular what's going to happen to finance. That's going to be sort of a canary in the gold mine kind of thing. Where is finance going to be flowing? And we also have to be watching our nation's capitals. And certainly looking at Westminster does not bode well. But thankfully there are many other initiatives and capitals out there. So that's what I would say about COP21 in 2 minutes.
Lovely, thank you, Jelte. Thank you, panel. So, a wide range of views, generally some cautious optimism coming through. So I'm relying on all of you now to have some questions forming in your mind. We've got 2 roving mics, so Matt or Claire will come to you if you put your hand up, and let's get the ball rolling. Anything about Paris? One at the back.
Yeah.
Okay, so to distill that question, why aren't you furious? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah. Oh, well,
Elizabeth.
I don't mind responding. I think the short answer is I don't believe that the UN is the answer. I don't think that they're the ones that are going to fix this. And I think I mean what I said in that I don't think that the agreement is an agreement about climate change. The agreement is an agreement about politics. And I think that there was a process where I came back where I was disappointed and maybe a bit angry and exhausted, and then also that was probably coupled with my anger at announcements in Westminster immediately after the COP, which actually I think I was probably more angry about than about anything to do with Paris, frankly. But yeah, I think my short answer is I'm not angry because it is no longer the UN's responsibility to fix this. It's everyone's, and it's every country, it's every business, it's every locality, it's every local authority. And I actually think Jelte put it very well, is that the agreement did as much as it could possibly do. And the reality is we like this big Deus ex machina concept where there's something that comes in at the end and saves us all, and that's the silver ticket, and it's all good and wonderful, and we were looking for an answer. But the reality is that the agreement was never going to give that. The agreement was going to give a framework and I guess a signal or something politically, but it was never going to outline, and maybe that has to do with my expectations going in. But what but I already said this, but I think my main point would be I'm more angry at the announcements that came out of Westminster immediately after, or any other government or any other business that is continuing to do the wrong thing on climate, than I am about any outcome from Paris.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah. Did you want to respond?
Just briefly, I wanted to add that I don't believe it's helpful to dichotomize like that, in the sense that it's not that we are not all in this together, as I already said. So we, by far and large, give a mandate to our lawmakers when they go to these negotiations when we vote. If we vote representatives that have an unambitious climate agenda, then this is what they will negotiate when they go to Bonn or Paris or wherever else. So if we elect governments that are actually embracing progressive climate agendas, then we can expect them to be ambitious. If we don't, then we won't get much. And this trickles down at all levels of society. So this is very much a byproduct of it's a snapshot, if you like, of what the world voters think about climate change today. And in this perspective, I would actually say this is quite good.
Another question. There's one down here at the front.
I think this leads on from what you just said about having the voters having to elect someone that's going to action on climate change. So with the Americans having their primaries right now and the fact that the Republican Party is full of a lot of climate deniers and being such a big emissions producer, does that make anyone a little bit worried that we might see a slow progress in America when we need to actually see an increase in progress there?
Excellent question. Who'd like to take the Trump question?
I'll choose it.
Hannah.
So obviously, what I found really interesting about when you look back at the numbers in terms of the negotiation, that something like the top 10 emitters emit something like 70% of our global emissions. So the massive shift in the amount of emphasis that's placed on 10, 20 nations is actually quite incredible, and really they're the ones that are basically going to govern a trajectory for everyone else. In terms of America, a kind of interesting point at the negotiations is when you look at the actual fine print of it, there's a very big difference in terms of word choice, in terms of should and shall, and they have very, very important dictations as to whether you're obliged to do something or whether you'll make a best effort to do something. And there was a kind of key controversy near the end where there was a controversy the US kicked up between whether something should be a should or a shall, and why they were so bothered about that was because if it was a shall, then it would have to get passed through Congress, which if you were in a situation where, say, the Republicans got into office, then they would be, it could probably be a very big issue. But the fact that it was a should means that it doesn't have to go through Congress. I know it's a really like kind of key distinction from really small words, and we sometimes kind of say, oh, it's just a word, but it has a really big impact. So kind of almost the deal's kind of been set up in the way that that can't happen, but obviously in terms of kind of the grassroots policy making, that could really be affected. But it doesn't mean that they will be out of the deal in that sense.
Maybe just a couple of words on this.
Annalisa, please.
It was mentioned earlier also the issue of, is the Paris Agreement legally binding? Journalists have written many silly things about this. So, one clear answer is the Paris Agreement is a treaty, and as such is formally legally binding on its parties. The issue of the Americans' ratification is a domestic law issue for the United States government to address. What they need to pass through Senate or not is a matter for their constitutional lawyers to consider. And this diatribe on the words was exactly related to that issue. But for everybody else, this is irrelevant. The obligations in the Paris Agreement, however, are phrased in different terms. So some obligations are unequivocally, legally binding in the sense that it says parties shall do this and that. Other obligations are instead termed differently. And this happens with all treaties of all kinds, not only with the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is no different in this connection. So some are enabling provisions. Parties can, for example, do emission trading and other market-based mechanisms to address climate change mitigation. So the truth, as with any other international agreement, is the practice of implementation will reveal what these provisions actually say. We can guess, we can interpret these treaties, but it's only when the parties will start implementing these provisions that we will have a measure of the stringency with which they interpret their obligations.
Can I come in briefly?
Yes, please.
So I actually think that there's probably not going to be very much action in terms of new action coming on from what's happened at Paris now in the next couple of years, because countries have submitted their INDCs, and as the gentleman in the back pointed out, they're not even on track to limit us to 2 degrees warming. And many countries have said that they're not intending to actually review those contributions immediately. The European Commission has said that they're not going to review their targets until 2018 at the earliest. Over the next year, what we'll see is countries officially ratifying the agreement, which can happen without the US signing on to it, and they can then later commit to enacting the recommendations in it. Interestingly, I think the Republican establishment, who are really, really scared of a Trump presidency, have been coalescing around his candidacy from the perspective of the fact that if he wins the primaries, he will either lose the general election, or worst case scenario, he'll have 1 term and he'll be out because it'll be an absolute disaster. And so actually, from a very, very cynical perspective, it would almost be better if Trump won the primaries, because we'd either not have a Republican president, or we'd have Trump for 1 cycle, and by the time the recommendations from the Paris Agreement would be being significantly implemented, he'd be out.
That's a risky strategy. Fantastic. Andy, you've got a question. Do you want the mic?
Hi, yeah. Andy Kerr. Just a question actually about the targets, because internationally we've only ever talked about meeting a 2-degree target. And obviously the Paris Agreement actually went a fair bit further by saying we want to keep well below 2 degrees and aspire to 1.5 degrees. Could the panel reflect on, from the sense of in the meeting itself, whether people really understood the magnitude of delivering that type of target at a national level?
Good question. Who'd like to take that?
I'll chip in.
Well, Hannah?
Kind of on that, one of my kind of key reflections of the conference was, so there was the kind of official negotiations going on in kind of one corner, and there was also side events, which was a range of academics, NGOs, policymakers, a range of different people giving different presentations on different aspects, so agriculture, technology, there was one on the INDCs, loads of different topics. And what I found really startling was the contrast between the two. I felt that within the negotiations there was a lot of talk of reducing to 1.5 degrees, and there was a very strong commitment to that. But what I found when I was went to the side events, well, first of all, everyone had set up their presentations to be for 2 degrees and were slightly embarrassed when they realised, well, scrap all of that, what I've just said. But what they were already saying in their presentations was that within all the individual sectors, not looking as a whole, but even within all the individual sectors, 2 degrees was incredibly challenging. Major transformations within all of our different sectors. So kind of what most of the opinions I saw there was that to then say, oh, I've just outlined that 2 degrees is very challenging, but now we're going for 1.5. The gauge and the feeling that I got from those was that 1.5 probably wasn't realistic. And I know that's probably not a particularly popular opinion, but in terms of looking at the harsh reality of it, that was the kind of perception I got from that.
Maybe I'll give a little bit background.
Annalisa,
Yes.
Jelte, yeah.
Where the 1.5 came from, politically, this was a very important agenda for small island states. Those states that are projected to be the most heavily impacted by climate change, for them this is a question of survival. Staying below 1.5 means that they may stay out of the water. For them this was a deal maker. If this was not in, they would not accept an agreement. So they really played hardball on this, and they got it in. As was just mentioned a minute ago, the issue, though, is really about the chasm between the politics of it and the scientific, realistic scenario that is being painted by the IPCC and others. It's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to get there. I mean, I was with a colleague from the IPCC at Paris, and she was looking at the text and said, why are they even talking about that? We are lucky if we make it to 2 degrees. But the nature of the politics in the process sometimes is such that impossible things are being discussed because they need to be discussed to flag a concern of some parties, in this case, the small island states.
Jelte.
Yes, thanks for a characteristically poignant question. My answer would be no. Most of the delegates were not aware just how transformative a change would be required to get near to 2 degrees Celsius. I think certainly the general public still is not aware that we're talking about effectively decarbonizing our entire energy system by 2050, which is not that far away when it comes to things like long construction period, nuclear power and like biomass options and so on, not to mention the fact that we will probably have to have technologies to actually remove carbon dioxide that we don't have yet. So my answer would be no. I think very few people are aware of it. And let's see the 2 degree Celsius target for what it is. It's a rhetorical device. Perhaps time will tell a mistake, frankly, because what if we don't make it? Do we then, give up? Or perhaps we would have been better off focusing on, first, getting emissions to the point where they aren't increasing, which is, by the way, where we're still at today. Emissions, the flux of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is still increasing, although some sectors are doing better than others. Then a next sort of key performance indicator might be getting emissions to decrease at some point down to 0.
Can I?
We've got a question. Oh yeah, Elizabeth.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly respond to that. I think this ties together a few things that I've been saying already. I think the reality is, as I was saying about the agreement and the process being political rather than about climate change, I think it demonstrates the fact that there was a lot of political will, and they wanted an agreement that was going to have headlines and be exciting, and that I think that was a part of it, the rhetoric part of it, the fact that they can include that, and that it felt like it was a nod to the campaigns and the sit-in and etc. that happened over the course of the couple of weeks. But I also think there's this, and also my comment about the fact that it's now not about Paris and it's not about the UN, and the reality is that 2 degrees, as was said by many other people, 2 degrees is going to be really, really, really hard, let alone 1.5. And I think I would like to see ambition level on a local level increase to address that challenge, to rise up to that challenge, and that's not happening anywhere yet. And we're 2 months later. So I'd like to see that over the course of 2016, but I'm not sure that it's going to. And my final thing on that would be, I think there's a real issue across every level of climate action, that people talk about this sort of policy action gap. And I think it's more than that. I think there's a value policy action gap. And while they might value a 1.5 degree language in the agreement, does that translate to policy, i.e. INDCs? No. Does that translate to action? No, not yet. So I'd like to see all of those things match up, but I think a good starting place is having 1.5 written in the agreement.
Sorry, I'm just going to come in on what you were saying. I suppose, though, if we are treating this as a rhetorical tool, and we've discussed that while some of the bits of the agreement may be binding, the implementation of them is non-punitive. There's no good way to sort of police this, and there's very little that's concrete in the language of the agreement. It's not really a law, it's more of a vision statement, and if we're treating it as that, and if we're all saying, well, 2 degrees is really, really hard, nigh impossible, people will die from climate change, even if we do keep the 2 degrees. And if we've already given up on it being possible, and or not given up, but if we're already all saying that it's going to be really, really difficult, then why not use 1.5 degrees as the rhetorical tool and the vision statement?
Good point. Let's have the question from the gentleman in the check shirt.
Thanks. 2 questions, or 2 points, I guess, of the same question, which is the artifacts that we're taking forward with each successive COP agreement. Do you think that going forward there's any pressure to get rid of the biogenic versus anthropogenic emissions division? And likewise, is there any pressure to switch from a territorial to a consumption-based accounting system? And can you talk about the implications of those?
Excellent. So for the second question, definitely it would be good to hear from Hannah. How about biogenic versus anthropogenic?
I'll take the
Jelte?
I'll take the consumption.
Okay, go for that.
Oh, you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Oh man, I was going to make notes and so on. Good question. Wow. All right. I mean, just talking about the last part of your question, which was accounting-based systems, and you mentioned currently they are territorial rather than consumption-based. So just so everyone's clear on this, there's a lot of different ways you can slice the pie when it comes to CO2. It may seem really obvious, and you know, many economists will tell you, oh, just introduce a carbon tax. What's the problem? And even assuming, you know, we get all the nations to agree, because as soon as there's a few that don't agree, you get huge problems and all kinds of nasty things like carbon leakage and ending up using often the most carbon intensive fuels that there are. But even then, there's different ways to go about it. Consider, you can just stick to where the emissions are happening, which is, I think, what you meant with territorial. You could look at what you're actually consuming. So even though you might not be emitting something when I'm eating that banana, but I might, you know, have to pay a tax for it because it had to get transported all the way from Ecuador with bunker fuel. That would be another way to do it. We could also do it at the wellhead, for example. That would be another accounting system. Go to where we're actually extracting fossil fuels, and that's where we put a tax. So yeah, that is a really big question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer. Any accounting mechanism you pick is going to give rise to all kinds of policy blind spots. You know, and certain countries would, and you could predict this, benefit or disbenefit in different ways. So that's a really big challenge. But I would say it is secondary to getting all the parties on board and keeping them on board. Because when it becomes really impossible is when you've got major stakeholders that are not around the table. You know, then you can pick any accounting system you want, but you're going to have huge issues. So I would still say, in that sense, the agreement was historical because of the UNFCCC framework, which we inherited from the 90s. You know, we have to have almost every single member party signing up, and they did. So it was a good start in that regard.
Hannah, production versus consumption-based emissions accounting.
Yeah, so this is a kind of key interest of mine. It kind of formed part of my master's dissertation. So just to be clear, the two accounting systems. So at the moment, our targets are set on how much each nation produces. So that's how much we produce within our borders. A switch to consumption is different because it takes into account all the embodied emissions that come into all the stuff we consume. So most of us sitting in the room, probably our footprints are, on a production basis, are lower than what we're actually producing because we import a lot of our stuff from other countries. So essentially we've shifted our emissions to other people. In terms of changing accounting systems to consumption, well, first of all, consumption's just a fairer way to do it. If we're looking at dramatic shift and change, then it has to be based on lifestyle, and your footprint has to reflect the lifestyle that you're living, and that's a reflection on the stuff that you consume. So first of all, it's a fairer way to do it. An additional benefit I see in terms of shifting to a consumption-based framework actually comes into finance. So when you do it on a production basis, every country will kind of set their targets and they'll kind of work on them on their own. And all I'm bothered about is the emissions that my country's producing. On a global level, I'm bothered about what other countries are emitting, but the carbon intensity with which they produce their goods, I'm not particularly bothered about because it doesn't have any influence on whether my nation meets my target. If you switch to consumption, I'm suddenly bothered about and it's primarily developed countries that produce a lot of our stuff. I'm suddenly bothered about how they produce their stuff and the carbon intensity of their stuff because it has a bearing on my targets. So one way for me to meet my targets is to help developing nations to develop on a cleaner pathway. And that is actually one facilitation for increased carbon finance. I will be willing to spend money for other countries to develop in a cleaner way if it then impacts on my targets. On a production-based framework, as a nation, I probably don't actually care that much because I'm interested in meeting my own target. So a switch to consumption is a fairer way to do it, but it's also maybe a more effective way to do it if you're trying to balance the need for development and mitigation at the same time.
Great answer. And just quickly before we go, so there's a question here and then to you in the blue jacket. So rephrase your biogenic, anthropogenic question. Haven't quite got it straight in my mind.
Well, is that distinction still useful, and does having it there shape our response to climate change? How would it be different if we didn't think of this division?
Okay, so from a physical science perspective, I guess from biogenic fluxes, we include them already in terms, and they're in the Paris Agreement. So the net flux, so you can use your peatlands and your trees as part of your national accounting. That's the way it's been historically. I think if you included all biogenic fluxes, so the fluxes during so at the moment for high latitudes, so the northern hemisphere high latitudes, our carbon emissions would be swamped in terms of the anthropogenic, the human ones, by the fluxes coming from the oceans and the soils. So we have that job of differentiating between anthropogenic, so human activities leading to greenhouse gases, and the biogenic fluxes. So we need good numbers for both, but actually differentiating is important to then see what progress we're making in terms of the anthropogenic forcing of the climate. So.
Can I come into
yes,
this as well? I think that for me, this is something I can't pretend to totally understand how we account for the difference, but this is something that I find particularly tricky, because as our climate is changing, the increased in biogenic emissions are our responsibility, because we've created a changed climate in which there are more biogenic emissions from places like tundra or forest fires, or et cetera, et cetera. So I can't pretend to totally understand that, but this is something that I actually find quite scary if you think about the volume of emissions from things like forest fires, whether it's Tasmania or Indonesia or the Arctic or permafrost or what etc. And we started this ball rolling down the hill, and I would question whether it's helpful to distinguish, because, and how do we distinguish? Is the permafrost emissions, is that our fault? Is that anthropogenic? Because we have created a climate in which they are emitting. So that's not really an answer. It's a question back to your question. But I think this is a particularly, something I don't know a lot about, but I find it particularly scary because it's very much out with our control.
So I'm almost tempted to volunteer Drew, who's in the front row here, and is one of the carbon masters doing the programme, who could explain this completely in terms of the feedback mechanisms, couldn't you, Drew? But I'm not going to go into that. Just in terms of the science, it's a key area for us, is understanding those feedbacks, and some of them are reinforcing the warming, so absolutely carbon loss from tundra. Some of them are reducing the warming, so the CO2 fertilisation effect, which we're seeing quite strongly at the moment, but as climate change intensifies, we can expect the news to get worse in terms of reinforcement. Let's go to the question over here. So yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Jelte, if I've got his name right, I said early on that finance is one of the keys to tackling climate change. Innovation also has a role to play. Technology, finding better ways of doing things can reduce the causes and consequences of climate change. My question to the panel is, do the panel think that there should be significant tax incentives available for research leading to innovation which can help reduce climate change?
Jelte, you were singled out there, so let's actually some time to think.
I'm always tempted to sort of take a little bit of a radical position, and I'm going to jump on that just for the hell of it now. I'm going to say that actually we already have a lot of the solutions. And a lot of the technologies that are already mature aren't sufficiently deployed and aren't benefiting from scale yet. So actually that's what I would prioritize right now. And also institutional innovation. Sure, technological innovation still has an important role to play, but just how we can source and coordinate, finance new methods of owning and generating renewable energy, and incentivizing carbon capture and storage through growing more trees, integrating it with biodiversity, that sort of thing. So I would say, we can't dichotomize this sort of thing, but if anything, just deploying currently existing mature technologies and more innovation in the institutional sphere is where more effort is needed.
I would second that, and it's something I think we did have when there were significant subsidies for solar and wind power, which saw significant growth in people using those in the local communities, and subsidies which have now been cut, and the implementation of these technologies are stagnating. And interestingly, going back to your point about anthropogenic versus biogenic, an interesting development that I've seen in people talking about this linguistic development is people talking about capitalogenic climate change, because, well, biogenic implies natural occurrence, and then anthropogenic implies created by people. But this isn't something that's being naturally created by people. It's being created by a system that's driven by mass profit based on exploitation of natural resources. And part of that profit making is making sure that companies are profiting from the types of technologies that are available. And if we make things like solar and wind, if we subsidize them and make them cheaply available, there's no incentive for that. So, which is a bit depressing, but yeah, there absolutely should be.
Can I quickly respond to
Yes.
something? You know, if it was up to me, we wouldn't subsidize renewables at all. You know, look at the massive headache renewable developers have to deal with because of all the subsidies, you know, lobbying against it, volatility, you never know what Amber Rudd's going to do next. You know, let's be clear, much more optimal would be if we taxed fossil fuels. Tax fossil fuels. I don't think we should even be talking about of subsidizing renewables. Let's tax fossil fuels. Just want you to remember that.
There's a very loud round of applause from the other economists.
From one economist.
From one of the economists. The guy in the blue jacket, please, question from you.
Hi, Paul Adderley, facilitated the Carbon Conversation, so there's links to your person-centred kind of approach. Really appreciate your feedback, your insightful feedback from the conference. I've learned quite a lot tonight. My question, though, is how does the COP21 agreement sit with the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership and also the one for the Pacific? And in the end, will the tip it trump any regulation? Sorry about the pun, but I couldn't think of a different word. But will it override really anything, any regulations that carbon territories have, national states have? In the end, TTIP will say, World Trade Organization, we govern here. That is anti-competitive. You're not having that.
Good question. Annalisa, what do you think?
Well, it's hard to tell as things stand just now because we really have little idea as to what the Paris Agreement will actually deliver. But I would say this once more highlights the importance of all being in it rather than, for example, some developed countries only, like with the Kyoto Protocol, because there we created a binary system that was unsustainable in the long run and really was not leading anywhere. If we have all the states together in reducing their emissions, this should, in theory, in principle, help. But who knows? We'll see.
TTIP, what do we think? Views?
I really don't know.
Okay. Good. Right. Let's. So we've got a whole load of hands. Just your right, and was the one here first? Was there, Claire? Actually, the gentleman at the back in the blue top, I think, was the first one I spotted.
Yeah, I mean, taxing fossil fuels, but also not subsidising fossil fuels as well would be another good way of going about it. My question, I guess, is about how much the messaging that was coming out after Paris, that this is a historic agreement, may kind of undermine efforts to engage people who are less engaged in climate change action, who need to be kind of really ramped up to meet this 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees target, and the messaging that this is a historic agreement, and in people's heads it might then translate into that's it, climate change is fixed, tick, focus on something else. Do you see that there's a risk of that happening?
What do we think? Hannah, what do you think?
In terms of, especially, I found this very telling when I was actually there in Paris, was you become almost aware of how much of a bubble it is. You're kind of sitting in a conference centre for a week, and it's very easy to get the impression when you're there that this is the biggest issue ever, that everyone's really passionate about, and everyone's here, we're all here together fighting it, trying to come up with solutions. And then you look on the news and it's not even on the front page of any of them. And I think a kind of key challenge coming out of that is that we're all here, or I'd expect we're all here because we're all really passionate about it, but I think we were probably all really passionate about it pre-Paris as well. So sometimes you feel like you're kind of preaching to the choir. And I've kind of found myself falling into the trap of speaking to people that maybe weren't particularly engaged with it before. And I don't know, for the past couple of months, the keyword Paris, to me, Paris has been synonymous with climate change and COP, and people kind of look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like the words are not the same. So in terms of the messaging that's came out of it, I think we've almost been kind of preaching to the choir. That's my take on it, that we've essentially kept the people engaged that we already were, but in terms of gaining more people to the cause, I don't see that happening very much yet. Whether that will evolve in the coming years, I don't know.
Urte, what, in terms of representing a large student body, what's your feeling of the impact of Paris on people's activity?
I think Paris, I think you're right in that the messaging is unhelpful from that perspective, but Paris provided a flashpoint opportunity for people who are outside the actual conference to do a lot of mobilization and to come together and share experiences. And in terms of the groups that I know and have been involved in, they are consistently growing, and Paris attracted a lot of new people to them. They may be sort of more usual suspects, people who would be more inclined to participate in something like that rather than, go to sort of the official part of the conference. But I guess, for me, going was the most sort of radicalizing aspect of it, because I was so angry at myself that I'd actually kind of believed in it and bought into it, and thought that this kind of could be the solution, and then having been in there, realized that I'd kind of given up my agency by actually being part of that, in the sense that I could have contributed a lot more by going and being part of the sort of actions that were going on outside of that. And I've certainly brought that back, and quite a few people who have come back from Paris have shared sort of similar impressions, so hopefully that will keep those communities growing.
Elizabeth, for your 2050 group, how do they respond?
I think I would agree with what Mike said, and also I can't take credit for pointing this out because actually he said this to me earlier, but there was something unhelpful about the messaging that 196 nations signed up to this, because actually it's everyone, and that's the whole world is much stronger, is a much stronger message than just a number, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything to anyone. And I felt that there could have been generally more coverage, there could have been better coverage, etc., etc. But I think for me this comes back to, perhaps there's people that disagree with this, but I think the biggest failure of action on climate change and environmentalism and environmental work over the past 40 years has been the way we communicate it. And perhaps that comes from my perspective that climate change and these issues are about people, and people are the problem and people are the solution. And so I think that we, and in some ways this is a big part of what I do in my day job, and a big part of what we do with 2050 is trying to communicate climate change, whether it's COP and international negotiations or whether it's the details of it in Scotland, to people in a way that they understand. And I can't say I have the answer, but I think that this is something that everyone that works on this and cares about this needs to think really long and hard about, the ways that we've been communicating this up until now, because it has to change. We cannot go on communicating about it in the way that we were, in the way that the media covered it, in the way that we have been over the past 10 years, because it's just not working.
Can I add something briefly? Yes. I think Paris was important in this regard because it sort of normalized the mainstream climate change. It's an everyday issue. It's not a sexy issue we discuss every conference of party or so. It's something that is about everyday life. So in this connection, I think the INDC's process actually helps. involving non-state actors. You may have heard of this NASCA portal, these ways of showcasing non-state actors, businesses, civil society, subnational governments. This is new. This was not there before, and it is very helpful, I think.
We've got quite a few hands up. So Claire and Matthew, who was next? You pick them. So on your side, yes, please.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of energy justice and if there was any discussion at the conference on also the fact that while we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, that there are also a lot of people in the world that don't have access to energy, and how we're going to bring that access without creating more kind of dependence on carbon.
Yeah, good question, to be honest. And if I can tie it into the previous question, what I was thinking, but I didn't want to say this, was but my first response to the question was actually, to most people on the planet right now, worrying about climate change is sort of it's pretty close to what economists would call a luxury good, although a luxury bad. A lot of people, let's not forget, still are really stressed out about getting food on the table, like tomorrow, over the short term. And it's exactly, and not coincidentally, in those areas where we can expect to see the highest GDP growth and the highest increase in energy access, because I'm talking about places with low electrification rates. So I might not be answering your question exactly, but this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest opportunities, more than just an opportunity, because if we miss it, we're in real trouble. It's jumping straight from having no energy access or being reliant on wood fuel, which is bad, not just for biodiversity, but from a CO2 point of view as well, straight to things like microgrids, solar PV, not being reliant on this old-fashioned centralized grid network that was designed specifically with fossil fuels and centralized generation in mind. So,
excellent question.
Can I come into this as well? I think my reaction to this would be a little bit along the same lines of my point about multilateralism before. I think that the helping these societies progress in a way where there's both equality in terms of what they want in life and what their conditions are and what they're able to achieve, etc. And doing that in a low carbon way, that depends on global cooperation, both from a financial perspective and from a sort of technology and skills transfer and support perspective. I was going to say something else, but it's gone now, so.
Good.
Never mind.
we'll come back to it. You still got one, Ben?
I think it's part.
It's been answered. Over to your side, Claire, actually. That's Chris.
Sorry. Hi. I keep hearing the phrase legally binding going around, and I'm not really sure I understand this concept perfectly. So if the treaty says that a country should do this or shall do that, and it's legally binding and it doesn't, then what happens? Do they get in trouble?
Annalisa, what does happen?
Now, there's two answers to your question. In the specific context of the Paris Agreement, we don't know, because this is part of the tiny little rules that have to be decided upon yet. So we don't know if, for example, trade bans will be used. They have been used in the past in some international environmental agreements. If you don't comply with your obligations, we don't trade with you. I am not a fortune teller. I can almost certainly tell you they will not go for this. It's been suggested in the past, but it's not very popular with many states. So there are other forms of, if you like, sanctioning that are more related to naming and shaming, and states respond to this to an extent. We are certainly not going to bomb a state because they don't comply with their obligations under the Paris Agreement. Having said that, there is a general truth to be recognized about international law, is that states tend to comply with their international law obligations most of the time. We notice when they don't because it's actually making the news. So this is a hopeful message, if you like, in this context. But clearly, and this is why I said earlier, these nitty-gritty rules will tell us how serious parties are about the Paris Agreement, because we will see how they intend to hold each other accountable for lack of compliance and what kind of sanctions, if you like, they would use.
I actually have a question coming back on that, if that's okay. How does that sit with, so you're saying that there is the possibility for things like sanctions, but how does that sit with the fact that in one of the articles of the agreement, it explicitly says that the implementation will be by a committee of experts and explicitly says that it will be punitive. So where is the flexibility that you're talking about?
No, this is exactly why I'm telling you the compliance mechanism that is envisioned in the Paris Agreement is yet to be designed, but clearly there is a couple of words there: non-punitive, facilitative. These are words that give you an idea as to what the parties have in mind.
But if it's sanctions, then it is punitive.
They normally speak about consequences. Sanctions is a transliteration that I used to be intelligible. Consequences, it's more like the word that is being used in these negotiations. Nobody speaks about sanctions. Even the word is scary.
You've got a question at the front here. Pass the mic.
I was just wondering about carbon taxing, because obviously to a certain extent that will reduce emissions, but is it sufficient when we still live in an economy that's very much focused on producing, using, and then discarding? Is it enough to just tax carbon to reduce emissions? And also, if I can possibly just say one more thing about, I agree with you that we do live in a society where we can worry about climate change, but isn't it worth linking issues of environmentalism like climate change to social issues and seeing them as one issue essentially, and how that links to food security, better than saying, oh, but because they don't have food, they don't need to worry about climate change?
Well, I'd also like to give the rest of the panel the chance to respond to your second thing. I would just say, actually, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in terms of the sort of structure of the climate change predicament, it is very similar in terms of its structure, you know, the form as the global maldistribution of resources, you know, and so the two are linkable. And that's partly what I meant with the way I answered that question, as an opportunity to do both things, and we kind of have to. Okay. With regards to the first, carbon taxes, well, it all depends on how you do it. And again, it mostly comes down to, this overlaps with the gentleman's question earlier, of how many nations you can sign up, and where are you going to apply the tax? Are you going to put it high enough? Or instead, are you going to send a signal to the oil and coal companies, whoa, the world is getting really serious about this whole climate change thing. Let's pump like crazy. Which, by the way, I think is not an unreasonable hypothesis for why oil is currently around $35 a barrel. I would like to believe that there is a possibility that the Saudis are taking seriously the fact that future COPs you know, are going to be increasingly legally binding with consequences and all that. So it's a long answer, and pragmatically speaking, it's probably politically not viable anytime soon to impose a tax that would actually work and do the job. So we kind of have to settle for second best, for example, by subsidizing renewables.
Let's take your second question, which is, I guess, about sustainable development and climate change, or linking these issues together. So Hannah, what do you think in terms of whether there's a need for that to be more overt, and how successful it might be?
I think there is definitely a need to link it more strongly to sustainable development and development needs, especially when you look at it in terms of the split we have in emissions from developed to developing countries. The cause for sustainable development is a key social issue in terms of, for one thing, climate change is a kind of full circle, so climate change will impact on food, energy, water. All of these are kind of human right issues and really key to development. But at the same time, it's that kind of vicious circle that as you produce these and create emissions, then it comes full circle. And it kind of comes back to the kind of the messaging question we had earlier, that clearly tackling it just as a climate change issue isn't really sticking. We're not really getting to where we are just viewing it as a climate change issue. People are naturally more inclined to care when you link it with social issues. Naturally, we do actually care about other people, and social issues do tend to gain more traction. And I feel that's maybe where we've slightly gone wrong. We've posed it too much as a pure science climate change issue, when it's really about core social issues and how we live our lives. And yeah.
Can I come in on this
Yes,
as well?
please, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I think, I know I said I think we've struggled and maybe failed to communicate climate change well, and I think that in the future, what we need to do is talk about it in terms of the range of other impacts it's going to have on people's lives, or is already having on people's lives, and that's the biggest and most important message. But I also think, and I'm not very comfortable with what has happened in the UN process over 2015, and I think it's somewhat unhelpful to separate the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals development and concept from climate change and COP, because they're inherently linked. And actually that, as a sort of side note, is something I was quite disappointed by at the COP, the extent to which these two agendas of the UN were not linked together by people on the ground, by UN officials, by the organisers themselves. And I think to see them as separate is incredibly unhelpful, and it seems like that's the narrative that the UN is pushing at the moment, and I wish that they were combined more.
I think we can probably move on. That's
super.
mainly
Just because they caught my eye, Ben, and then Claire, and then we'll go over to the left. So Ben first.
I'm interested in what Elizabeth just said, because at the 2009 COP, it seemed to me that the big split was between the climate change world here and the development world there. And I had the sense that the two had come closer together, and adaptation had become a much larger part of it, and that the awareness that the world needed to develop had been built more into the system, rather than it being quite as separate as you make out. And I wonder whether, from the legal point of view, not the legal, but the sort of technical point of view, that was the case, or whether it was just the way people were talking.
So just to come back on that, I think it's better, definitely much better, but I think the reality is the agreement itself doesn't really recognise the SDG and development issues. It maybe does in the preamble, or it maybe pays a little bit of lip service to a few of the issues, but I think they largely go untouched. And I'm not sure, I have to say, I'm not sure on which side I think needs to give, because I think the SDGs could more explicitly talk about climate change, because I think climate change impacts on every single one of the SDGs, and really it's only mentioned in one, potentially arguably two or three. So I think that both sides are missing the trick a bit. It's certainly better than it was, without a doubt, but I think it's confusing for people that aren't coming back to the communication thing. In my day job, I work for an organisation that runs the Eco Schools programme across Scotland, and they've been pushing the messaging around the Sustainable Development Goals. But as an organisation, the rest of what we've been talking about has been about COP and the COP outcomes. And so if you're a 12-year-old in a school that we interact with that volunteers on this and this, what does that messaging say to you? And how is that confusing for you as a person who is not involved in this sector, to get these two different narratives pushed at you and be told that both of them are the most important ones, and not be shown how they link? And so I think it's less of an issue for the people in this room and more of an issue for when it comes to explaining what's happening to people that are still learning about the process.
Just briefly, unfortunately, what sustainable development actually is not written in stone anywhere. That means that we have processes like the SDGs that are meant to facilitate the greater understanding among states as to where they should be going. Now, I think there is no ambiguity there. Sustainable development is, in the understanding of SDGs, climate resilient development. If it's not climate resilient, it's not sustainable. This is the understanding today. It may not have been a few years ago, it's definitely today. From there, the principle, the concept, how do you translate it in practice? This is where it's really difficult. As a matter of the politics of it, in the climate negotiations, there is a lot of pressure from all sides, and not condoning these people for not doing an amazing job. But it's true that if you follow this process, you may have noticed there is gender issues, there is human rights issues, there is development issues, there is all sorts of issues that converge, because climate change touches upon all of these things. So what these negotiators tend to do is to kick issues away for other processes to deal with, which is fair enough because this is what these processes are actually supposed to do. The climate negotiations cannot fix all evils of humanity. They are there to address climate change. Sustainable development is addressed by other institutions, should of course be in the back of the mind of negotiators. They shouldn't forget what they negotiate in those rooms when they come to the climate negotiations, but it's already difficult enough as it is.
I like it. Right, we're moving into our last few minutes, last 10 minutes. So we'll take a question from Claire, and then we've got some more over on the left and one at the back, just at the front here.
Okay, so this might be a misunderstanding or misreporting on COP, but I had the impression that agriculture and aviation were sort of largely left out of what was being said. And do you think we can really make a lot of progress in terms of cutting emissions without having really strong targets on those two industries?
So, aviation and shipping, they mentioned there. Agriculture. And agriculture, yeah.
Happy to deal with aviation and shipping then. These two issues have been on the table for a long time. And because it's exactly in the lines of what I've just said, because they are so contentious and difficult to address, the parties to the UNFCCC have decided to leave it to ICAO and the IMO, the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organizations. Have these two institutions addressed the problem in a decent way? No. Should they do more? Yes. Have the parties to the UNFCCC told them to do so? Yes. Hopefully they'll do better now, but again, it's one of those issues that is more a matter of politics, really, rather than lack of mandate. They decided to corner these sub-issues like agriculture and leave it on the side because there is so many contentious issues there that it was thought to be safer to leave it to the experts to address. Was it a wise decision? Who knows?
Good response, right?
Can I come
yes.
in on the aviation?
Go
I
for
think
it. Yeah.
This is maybe uncomfortable for all of us, but I think if you think about, I'm uncomfortable with the extent to which this was left out, and I think I'm uncomfortable with the decisions about air passenger duty. I'm uncomfortable with a lot of the decisions around shipping and airplane use and etc. and policies around that and the finance behind that. But I think the reality is, and this is something that is not just down to the UN or whatever aviation body there is. The reality is, if you think about us having a certain number of amount of emissions that we can emit in time, and a flight from here to Australia, for example, emits a certain amount of emissions, and you think about a cap, who does that take away from? Because if that flight is emitting that amount of emissions here, whose food does that not cook? Who does that not provide light to in Africa? Who, you know, and you could go on and on and on that list. And if you think about the aviation, the failure to deal with the aviation issue, I think, is a justice and human rights issue, because it is, I get on a flight to Australia and that's me saying that my flight to Australia is more important than someone eating tomorrow in terms of emissions, in terms of, if we think about that in a global perspective. And that's really uncomfortable. And I don't know how we're going to start to address it, but I think it needs to be a part of these global frameworks. Otherwise, how can we begin to talk about it in the same context?
Powerful message, Elizabeth. Right, questions over on this side. Claire, you pick us on. We've got time for probably 3 or 4 more. David.
We've certainly seen history being made in these last months. And perhaps the political zeitgeist catching up eventually with the science, the 1.5, even if it was glibly signed or glibly agreed. What I'm conscious of is, though, that stuff is happening. There are changes happening at local levels. Renewable energy is being introduced. The price is coming down near by 80% and so on. What do the panel feel about that this is something happening over there? What needs to happen here? And how do we bring it home?
Urte. what should the university, bringing it really close to home, what should the university be doing that it's not doing? Tell them.
Well, for starters, which we're kind of on the path to, is we need to seriously look at our carbon emissions targets, which is a really, really obvious one, but in the sense that the targets were set not that long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even less than that, but they were set at absolute targets, and now we've been missing them for years. And the excuse is, well, the university is growing in terms of its estate's footprint, in terms of number of students, so, well, it's okay. I'm exaggerating, of course, and this is being reviewed at the moment, but I'm just shocked that, you know, as 5 years ago, no one had that thought, that the university was going to grow, and actually we need to look into more ambitious and different ways to set those targets. I've been doing a lot of work on ethical investment during the course of the year, and again, I think there's been a big culture shift, and we've seen the announcement that the university has divested from 3 of the biggest coal and tar sands companies. There's still a lot to look at there. The university still does hold investments in oil companies. There's a lot to look at in terms of the mutual funds that the university invests in and what they're doing, and looking at perhaps other types of pooled funds to invest in, investing in things like the Environmental Tracking Index, which is a form of mutual fund which tracks companies but with sort of exclusions or aspirations to their ethical targets. We need to be looking at food, and crucially we need to be linking food not just to it being local as much as possible, but then when food is out of season, still importing food from far away. We actually need to be changing our eating habits in order to be eating only food that is seasonal. And that's, you know, again, that means in the wintertime you shouldn't be eating certain kinds of fruit. It's not enough to just say, well, we source locally whenever possible. There needs to be a culture shift in that.
I was pointing at Jelte's banana. Yeah, please, Hannah. Yeah.
Just in terms of thinking about how we then translate this into personal action and moving forward, I think a key change we need to see is in the way that we've framed our targets. So nations have all set kind of different targets on different levels. Some have done absolute emissions, some have done carbon intensity reduction, some have done below business as usual, but these are all high-level targets that they don't actually really speak to people on the ground. Does anyone in this room actually know, as a UK target, what that means your per capita emission footprint needs to be, what your per capita emission footprint is at the moment, where that gap is, how you can start chipping away at that gap? Like, most people don't know that, and until you start framing the targets in a way that people can start to engage with them, look at what they're doing, look at what they need to do to get to a level where they're meeting those targets, then you're not really going to truly engage people. So I think reframing the targets in a way that everyone can understand is a key necessity.
We've got time just for one more question, I'm afraid, which is going to be good news for our bottoms because these stalls are very hard. But so we'll take
your posture as well.
We'll take your questions, the last one. If you've still got other questions, though, hopefully we can all stick around for a bit to take questions individually. But please, the last question to finish us off.
It might be a suitable last question. It's really about what we can do. And a lot of us here aren't, you know, we're just general activists, if you like. We've got our own interest. Britain, I mean, the UK has put forward its plan. I've forgotten the acronym for it. I got lost with the development goals. I thought I had it in my head. So in the months ahead, let's say the next year or two, with elections and things coming up, what can we do? There is a plan, and that various actions have to be taken by Parliament and by other bodies. So where is it best to put our meagre resources in terms of pressure on politicians?
That's a great question. We're going to get all the panellists to respond on that. Jelte to start with.
Wow, how much time do we have?
Let's go for a minute each.
Oh gosh, I'm tempted to tell this little story about this paper I read a while ago where they compared the intelligence of primates using different methods. And generally humans win out, you'll be surprised to hear. But there's one experiment in which humans, time after time, actually are at the bottom, so they do less well compared to bonobos and chimps and gorillas and orangutans. And the experiment goes as follows. So they go to infants of these primates with a very complicated box, and the researcher will go through a long, complex sequence of manipulations, you know, like there's a bell and like a hooter sort of thing. It gets rotated, knock on it 3 times, and then finally you pull the lever and boom, out comes the banana or whatever the thing is. So the humans will get this instantly, or like after just a few tries. Really, really, really good emulators, which is something that we can potentially use to our advantage, but we don't have the critical mass to do it yet, which is the point of this overly long story. Sorry. all the other chimps, all the other primates, the gorilla, you have to show it 100 times and so on. And then finally it gets it. But after several runs, the human will still be perfectly following all the manipulations, whereas all the other primates figure out, you don't have to do all the other stuff. You can go straight to the drawer and get the candy out. So, point being is, I think we need to leverage everything we know about human behavior. We have to make burning coal, in particular, really, really uncool. Strategic, not just divestment, and not just focused first on coal. I would say let's forget about gas for now. Like, high lignite coal has to be just completely, no one would touch it because you would get shamed, and reinvest that strategically again into preferably renewable energy generation that you own and control yourself. In the case of the university, CHP, solar panels, and perhaps biomass.
Lovely answer. Annalisa, where do we focus? You have to pick one focus.
I think just looking at ourselves is really the major difference that we in this room can actually make. Where do you buy your electricity from? Where is it sourced? How much do you use your car? If you need to use your car at all, how much meat you eat? You know, all this stuff, this is all carbon intensive. If everybody started to think more about these kind of issues, we'd be going far in tackling this problem, I think.
Love it. Succinct. Elizabeth?
I would agree with that, but I'd go one step further. I think that everyone that's looked behind the curtain, that knows the reality of what we're coming up in, that the reality of the challenge and the reality of what's at stake, has a responsibility to act as a leader and an influencer wherever they are. So that means engaging with your politicians. Are you participating in hustings that are coming up? That means using your vote where it matters. That means engaging with your workplace, your employer. What policies do they have? What influence can you have? Are you asking difficult questions of people? Are you working with your parents or your children or your peers? Are you working with your friends? What are you doing in your community? I mean, it's everyone, and it's everywhere, and it's everything. And that doesn't just mean, it means looking at yourself, but it also means looking at what influence you can have and where and what impact that can have longer term.
I'm really glad we're recording this. This is fantastic. Hannah, how about you?
Yeah, I feel like we're all coming up with the same answers.
It's getting harder as we go along, isn't it? I know, but please.
Yeah, so just to build on that, starting with looking at yourself, so look at your own footprint, your own personal impact and your lifestyle choices, and start to tackle the big ones. We have a tendency to kind of criticise the targets at that kind of higher level that we've set and say, oh, they're not ambitious enough. But the reality is most of our footprints in the room don't meet the targets that we've set already. And we do need to start doing that before we can really start complaining about them not being ambitious enough. So beyond looking at your own footprint, I'd be inclined to say education, because that's what I'm currently involved in at the moment, but thinking about smart education and communication. So I think we have this tendency to think that, you know, shoving the issue in people's faces, almost kind of guilt shaming them into changing their lifestyles is going to work. If we tell them that enough people are going to die from this, that they're suddenly going to change their behaviour, and that just hasn't worked. So thinking about smart education and smart communication, I think, is a really key message to engage the people which aren't currently involved in the issue.
Great answer. Urte?
I'm actually going to disagree slightly with this narrative that's kind of happened over the past few panelists, in the sense that I don't think this individualist rhetoric of look at your own choices is actually particularly helpful. I was in a meeting recently with a bunch of senior university people where we were talking about developing a new measuring tool for carbon emissions targets, which was going to feed into the new, the new carbon emissions targets. And someone, it's not anyone in this room, Dave, before you, someone said, well, why don't we launch a big campaign where we're going to encourage staff to think about plastic bag usage and whether they're bringing their lunch in Tupperware and stuff. And it's just it's just really missing the point. Like, it is not the responsibility of someone who's making a minimum wage to worry about like whether they're eating a sandwich that's that's like packaged in recycled packaging. And it's not the responsibility of someone who like really needs a job and is barely making enough money to support their family to worry about whether they're taking like a car to work or whether they're biking for an hour in the morning. Like, yeah, these are all positive things that we can think about, but I actually think the most important thing that we can do is to convince people and show people that this is a systemic issue and it's the responsibility of governments and it's the responsibility of corporations and the people who are profiting from climate change.
Great. Lovely way to finish, Urte. So we are going to finish there, and hopefully when we go outside we're all not going to be hit by flying masonry and things. Do take care. I'd just like to thank Claire and Matthew and the Social Responsibility and Sustainability Department and the Global Academies and the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, who are our hosts today. Thank you to all of you for making it through the weather, asking fantastic questions. Like I say, do come up afterwards if you've still got questions you want to ask. But most importantly, I want to thank this fantastic panel. Thank you.